Hey guys, we're picking up here looking at video 18 on polling, which is a really, really fascinating topic, especially getting into the election of 2020 and knowing how this is just so much up in the air based on who shows up to vote. And it's very difficult to predict that with polling numbers. So here's just a real quick like cartoon. You know, I love cartoons. I think I even showed you this one before, but it's so good, I'll show it to you again. Would you say you generally trot or do you prefer more of an amble? Oh, I hate these Gallup polls. Funny stuff there because obviously you get the clipboard, right? This is typical pollster kind of appearance there. And Gallup polls, that's just funny. You guys have a chance to look at some Gallup polls here in just a second. Okay, so when we look at poll results, this is getting into 6.3, 6.4. I'm actually asking that you read 6.3 and 6.4. It's not too much data, but it's a little bit understanding on poll results. And I want you to take away a couple of things, okay? So if I give you just kind of the big picture idea on knowing how to read an accurate poll, let's talk about it, okay? I've got two slides here. This is a great picture showing, what happened with the election of, I think it's 1944, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's 48. But when Dewey defeats Truman is what it says, but ultimately Truman wins. And this is because the people who did the poll, if you remember this from history, they only called people on the phone. And by only calling people on the phone in the 1940s, people who had phones were largely going to be or maybe 44, excuse me, people who had like more money, more Republicans were the ones who had phone, the ability to have a phone. So the fact that their survey was very much skewed to give you a lot of data from one subset made it an imbalanced, overall assessment. And they thought Dewey, the Republican, was going to win, and ultimately Truman wins out as, again, just a great kind of understanding and how we can take away, wow, you've got to be careful when you start printing headlines in advance of these elections, and who knows what's going to happen. Again, case in point, 2016 was another big one, right? The fact that everyone, except for a few newspapers, had Hillary Clinton as the, presumptive nominee. She's going to win this thing. And yet Trump comes out with a victory, electoral college victory, if nothing else. This really shocked a lot of people because the polls were wrong. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay. Evaluating polls. On balance, most national and regional polls are fairly reliable. Yet they're really far from being perfect, right? So I would say that national poll data is okay to kind of know trends. But we don't vote by president by the national trend, right? We do it state by state. So you've got to take into account the individual states, and then those that really matter. We know which ones are competitive. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, Ohio. Those are polls that I want to look at. I don't really care about national poll data because it's incredibly difficult to assess that when there's so many different elements and who knows who's answering the phone and whether or not it's skewed correctly and if they're being reliable. There's this thing called the Bradley effect, which is the idea of like, I'm not going to really tell you who I'm going to vote for because I'm fearful that you're going to accuse me. And there's a little bit of that with like the Trump supporters. It's called like the silent Trump vote. There's some people who might not indicate that they're going to vote for Trump, just being fearful that, they're going to get called, whatever you want to call a Trump voter. But so they're hiding that on poll data, but they're the silent majority, as Trump would say. They're the ones that would turn out on election day unequivocally and vote for him, even though they wouldn't answer that on a poll. So this is where polling data has got to be taken very, very cautiously. Okay. Potential problems include their inability to measure the intensity, stability, and relevance. And that's true. You don't know necessarily who's going to show up to vote. You don't know if it's really intense, if it's a passionate supporter, or if they're kind of on the fence and they might not come out either, or it might change as well. Another potential problem is that polls and pollsters can sometimes shape the opinions, and they can do this in how they may ask a question, which is why it's really important that you ask a question in the same way and to get an actual result that's comparing apples to apples. You don't want to ask two different questions in a different way and then try to compare those data because it's just different. So anyway, we'll talk about that some more. Limits on public opinion for sure. Public opinion is the major, but by no means the only influence on public policy. Remember, we're not a democracy, so public opinion does not drive public policy. Even though public opinion on an issue may be this, that doesn't mean that's the law of the land. It has to be passed through Congress or has to be decided in a court case in order for it to become official policy, if you will. But yes, public opinion is not the determining factor on that. They're not elections, right? They're certainly not substitutes for elections, and you got to be very cautious. And when you see polling data is trending in one way, again, sometimes that can be skewed. Sometimes that is inaccurate. And so trying to figure out what polls to believe is really challenging, which is why I would encourage you to not buy too much into the polling data. Sometimes they create a poll just to kind of sell to get some money, but it's not really accurate, or it's done in a way, but stuff changes. I mean, who knows what's going to happen between now and the election? And so all the polling results could absolutely change. And that's another factor that could have came into the 2016 election. A couple of weeks before the election, Hillary Clinton was investigated by James Comey for possibly being involved in corruption with the FBI. And of course, that went nowhere. But the fact that you had a candidate that was investigation under the FBI 2 weeks before an election, you can't tell me that didn't have an impact on some of those kind of like on the fence voters. Do I support? Do I not? And so that could have a big impact there. So anyway, that can definitely change. Here's a couple of things I want to talk about is polls and like how you have an accurate poll, okay? The first kind of method that we could say are just trash polls or straw polls, right? These are polls like which member of I don't know which kind of cultural show you guys watch. I was going to say, the Twilight movie do you associate with the most or something, or which character in Star Wars are you most like or something. It's just silly polls. Which Disney princess are you, right? That's a straw poll, right? So again, it's just a typical entertainment poll. A random sample is really good to have. A random sample is going to try to give you a better picture, if you will, of the data. So think of it like a soup analogy. The idea that you don't have to drink the entire bowl of soup to be able to know what the soup tastes like. You can just get a sampling of it. So by trying to get that random sample is really important. If you are really going to be a sophisticated pollster, you can do a scientific poll. And that's when you make your data represent the group that you're trying to survey. So if you're trying to get data on the country, you look at, okay, what's the percentage of men versus women? So my poll needs to kind of be based on that. So if I don't get a lot of African-American women answers, then anytime I do have a poll with an African-American woman response, that answer is going to be multiplied by a certain number to overcome the lack of responses that I get from that demographic, if that makes sense. The most surveyed group of people are white women. So their responses are going to be counted as less, if you will, in a scientific polling, which is why when you get on one of these polling, they're going to ask you your age. They're going to ask you, what race or ethnicity are you? They're going to ask you for your college background or educational background. They're going to try to get as much data as they can on you, and you can feel free to straight up lie. And they have, that's just part of the problem of polling. They're reliant on information, as you can lie about anything with a poll, right? Like there's nothing that says you have to tell the truth. So that can cause some problems. But again, they're going to try to make your answers to fit in with their overall model for America and to try to create a pretty good model, which is always tough. All right, so you got a couple of different other things here. Importance of wording of the question. Focus groups is when you get like a group of 12 people and you just ask them okay, you're representative of the millennial generation. So let's just bring in a bunch of millennials and let's ask them questions. Or let's bring in a bunch of 40 to 50-year-olds. Let's ask them a question to try to get somewhat of an idea of what that demographic is going to do. But again, there's problems with that. All right, accuracy. I want to talk about two things. Margin of error is really important. Okay. You want your margin of error to be less than about 5%. And some of you guys who've done surveys before and looking at, GovSchool, you've done your own research, you can probably fine tune this a little bit more, but we're usually trying to shoot for about 5% or less for the margin of error. And keep in mind, if you have a poll and it's like Trump is and Biden, right? And Biden's beating Trump right now, 52 to 48. But there is a 6% margin of error. That poll's basically trash because what they're saying is that this could skew 6 points, one or the other. And that obviously determines who could win, if you will, right? Depends on the states and whatnot. But margin of error is really important to know. And then the last one to know is strength in numbers, right? You always want to shoot for about 1,000. Anytime you can get more than 1,000, you can start building a lot of credibility. Sometimes it's got 1,500, sometimes 2,000. But the more numbers you have, the stronger your poll data will be. If you give a poll and it's out of 100 people, again, you got to take that in consideration as like, is that really representative of the overall population? Okay, so knowing that, here's a couple questions I want to throw out there to you. This is looking at Gallup polls, right? So Gallup daily election polling result for the presidential election, Obama versus McCain, right? So this is going back in 2008. Okay. Identify one trend in the 2008 presidential campaign depicted in the graph. And I guess a trend you could talk about is a lot of stability, where you see Obama is constantly in the lead, right? Obama is constantly getting over a majority throughout most of the whole month of October. Very few times does McCain ever get close to catching up with them, but usually Obama's in the lead. You can say, or McCain's behind, okay? Identify two pieces of information that you would need to decide whether or not this is a valid poll. Well, going back, what accuracy do we need? We need to see the margin of error. Do you see the margin of error? No, it's not there. So that's one of them, okay? Another thing you need is like what? Numbers. How many people are actually polled in this? I mean, is it 100? Is it 1,000? So knowing that kind of information as far as like where you, the numbers and possibly even like how they were able to get those numbers. Is it done through emails or done through phone call? And method of polling could be interesting as well to kind of know whether or not it's a valid poll or not. Okay. Explain why the information from B is important to evaluating the poll. Again, self-explanatory, right? You got to know the margin of error to know what's the problems, how accurate is the poll. You also have to know, like how many people were surveyed to know if this is an accurate reflection or how the poll was conducted. Explain how one of the following factors may have influenced an individual's response to the poll. Again, we go back to family and school. I think these are great questions here. Family, this is the number one influence on political socialization, as we said. So if your family is typically more Democratic, you're going to be more of a Democrat, right? If your family is more to the right and they're Republican, you're typically going to be more of a Republican, and that just deals to political socialization, okay? And this is across the board. The biggest influence on who you are as a person is your family. School is going to be another one. Again, education, right? The more education you have, the more likely you are to vote. And we can look at some trends and that kind of thing. And like, college educated might lean a little more to the left. Non-college educated lean a little bit more to the right. Okay. That was fun. I got one more question for you here, and let's see how we can do on this one. Maybe I got two more questions. Hold on. Which of the following elements of polling likely created the difference in the poll results? Sorry, I read the question first, and then I come up here and I look at the prompt. What one issue mattered most to you in deciding how you voted for president, right? So yeah, that's a pretty big difference. The economy is 35% here, and then and it was 58%. Well, let's go here. Number one, it was unprompted first response to an open-ended question, meaning they just said, what issue mattered you the most? And you could have been like legalization of marijuana, woo. And that's not even on here, right? So you would be in this category, okay? The first choice from 5 options read to respondents. So if I actually gave you the choices, 58% of people say the economy. Well, this is a great example of not comparing apples to apples. You can't compare these two sets of data. They're asked in a different way, so you're going to get different responses, right? So I would say that answer is going to be C there, right? The formats of the survey questions are different, and that you have one open-ended and one closed-ended. Okay, one more. I like to give you just a lot of sample questions here. It says use the bar graph to answer the questions. All right, so we got a bar graph there looking at conservatives and liberal voters. Describe the percentage of Democrats in 2014 who describe themselves. That's terrible. Come on now, you come up with different words. Describe it. Describe themselves as mostly liberal. All right, so I'm going to go 2014, mostly liberals, that color. So it's about 33%. That's it? Okay. B, describe a trend over time that the data illustrates. Well, one trend I can see is pretty telling. I don't know if I see too many trends here, a little bit back and forth. A big trend, though, is going to be that the percentage of liberal voters within the Democrat Party is increasing, right? Mostly liberal is somewhat going up in some ways, and the percentage of Democrats with political values, Yeah, I guess you could say that, even though we have like 34 here, 35 here. I don't know. This is a pretty tricky poll to kind of read if we're looking at overall numbers, but there's definitely a percent of Democrats, right, that are either going to be mostly liberal or consistently liberal. There's increasing numbers, right, are becoming, they're not moderates. They're becoming more liberal. Okay. Draw a conclusion about that trend. And you could talk about how the Democrat Party is getting more passionate about certain issues. Maybe it's about the environment, right? Maybe it's about healthcare, right? But certain issues are moving the Democrat Party more to the left than being somewhat on the, again, not just mostly liberal, consistently liberal. It's increasingly becoming more liberal. Explain how the data and the bar graphs illustrate the role of ideology on the political party system. And this has a big impact because as one party starts getting more to the left or more to the right, this makes it difficult to have compromise, right? To find that common ground. Over here, you can see there's about 33% are mostly conservative. And then these down here are consistently conservative. So again, I don't know, consistently and mostly, I guess you're trying to say that these people are definitely more conservative, if you will, right, than these. But I don't like the wording of that. But anyway, I would say that it just makes it harder to compromise and to come to some kind of conclusion. Okay, guys, that was fun. Hopefully you're doing all right. That was it on political polling. I want you to read chapter 6.3, 6.4 in OpenStax textbook to give you a little more information on that. But that's it for chapter 6. Thanks for watching all my videos this week, guys. I will see you all very soon in a Zoom. Take care. Goodbye.